Well, my challenge will be to keep on time. So I'm just marking things out here. Okay. Well, good afternoon, comrades. It's an honor to be in your company today. And I want to thank Mark, and I would like to thank the organizers of this conference for inviting me, and to thank the life speaker, Star Blanket, for blessing this momentous occasion, I think. It's good to be back in my native land, and especially gratifying to be back in Regina for the first time in 35 years. The last time I was here was in 1980 on a coast-to-coast book tour. I think it was Halifax to Vancouver, for an elementary school teacher's journal that I published in 1980, and that became a book, Life in Schools, actually. I seem to recall, though, another guest that appeared on the same show with me here in Regina. I'm pretty sure it was here. G. Gordon Liddy, the infamous Richard Nixon operative, who was convicted of conspiracy, burglary, and illegal wiretapping in the Watergate break-in. And as I seem to recall, this CIA agent liked to brag about toughening himself up by eating sewer rats and holding a fired-up blowtorch to his forearm without so much as flinching. That's what I remember about Liddy. He also went on, interestingly enough, to tour gullible university campuses, speaking with Timothy Leary. They took the show on the road. Timothy Leary of LSD fame. Dr. Leary actually gave me my first diploma on a piece of paper that he wrote for me at the Carousel Ballroom in San Francisco in 1968. And it read, "Diploma, Peter, you are now free." Well, speaking of Richard Nixon, it was interesting because in 1980, when I was first here in Regina, Richard Nixon published his book, The Real War, which was really a malefic mystification about the Vietnam War, and knocked me off of McLaren magazine's bestseller list. Thank you, Tricky Dicky. Well, after the last few days, I'll no longer associate Regina with Gordon Liddy and Richard Nixon, but with the wonderful talks I have been privileged to hear over the last few days. So thank you again for inviting me. I'll just give you a brief rundown of some of my work to set the context for Comrade Jesus. Back in 1986, in a book called Schooling as a Ritual Performance, which was actually my doctoral dissertation from OISE, where I had the great privilege of working with Edmund O'Sullivan and Roger Simon, and the late Roger Simon and others, I raised some academic eyebrows by writing about knowledge as enfleshed or embodied. I was talking about knowledge as embodied. And for the next few years, I continued my work in comparative symbology, mostly following the work of Victor Turner, Richard Schechner, Jerzy Rakowski, etc. But eventually I realized that working at the level of epistemology, while important, was insufficient. So I returned to Marx. Volver a Marx. My conviction was, and still is, that, in quoting Joel Covell, there will be no true resolution of racism so long as class society stands, inasmuch as a racially oppressed society implies the activities of a class-defending state, nor can gender inequality be legislated away so long as a class society with its state demands the super-exploitation of women's labor. Capitalism, and not just the sudden discovery of neoliberal capitalism, has always been about the alienation of human labor, has always commodified our subjective development, our agency, turning relations between people into relations between things, and helping to create the conditions of possibility for various species of racism, sexism, patriarchy, and other social antagonisms and dependent hierarchies. Capitalism is more than the sheet anchor of institutionalized avarice and greed, more than excrement splattered on the coattails of perfumed bankers and well-heeled speculators. It's a world eater with an insatiable appetite. And capital has strapped us to the slaughter bench of history from which we must pry ourselves free to continue our work of class and cultural struggle, creating working class solidarity, an integral value system and internal class logic capable of countering the hegemony of the bourgeoisie, while at the same time increasing class consensus and popular support. Inherent in capitalist societies marked by perpetual class warfare in the capitalist mode of production is structural violence of a scale so staggering that it can only be conceived as structural genocide. Gary Leach has argued convincingly and with a kind of savage aplomb that capitalist-induced violence is structural in nature and indeed constitutes a form of genocide. So my work has generally been aimed at genocide, ecocide, epistemicide, and the exploitation of human labor. The cobalt vault of our imagination, from which memories cry out and dreams are born, has been constructed out of the windswept debris of dead cities, destroyed civilizations, nations brought to servitude by the mailed fist of the world eaters, those whose imperial eyes sweep over the clearings when the dust of destruction has settled and seek to plunder the resources of entire nations, caring nothing of the aftermath, nothing of the blood that soaks into the earth or pools in the sewers of the heart, nothing of the blight brought to humankind. Is it too late to re-enchant the world, to remold the planet in mytho-poetic terms, to create a past dream time, a mystical milieu in the present, to give ourselves over to dream divinities, to live in the eternal moment, to mold sacred totems from the damp clay of the riverbed? And while we ponder this possibility, the armies of the night march on, sneering at the pious surrender of the oppressed. Well, the ensuing years, I've spent more and more time in Latin America. Instituto McLaren de Pedagogia Crítica was established 12 years ago in Ensenada, Mexico. Since that time, I've tried to align critical pedagogy to revolutionary social movements throughout Latin America, Europe, North America, and elsewhere with varied success. 2006 was a pivotal year. That year, I was placed at the top of what was called the Dirty 30 list by a well-heeled right-wing organization that targeted 30 UCLA professors for being communist sympathizers and anti-American. Labeled as the most dangerous professor at UCLA, this right-wing organization offered to pay students $100 to secretly audio tape my lectures, $50 to provide notes from my notes taken from my lectures. That same year was an interesting year because the office of President Hugo Chavez in Venezuela invited me, despite my atrocious Spanish, to help bring critical pedagogy to the Bolivarian Revolution. But I remember one day in Miraflores Palace, President Chavez cautioned me that whatever critical pedagogy would develop in Venezuela would be Venezolano. In other words, they would not be transplanting Peter McLaren's ideas in Venezuelan schools. And he encouraged me to be a learner as much as somebody that was going to share some of his work. and this was advice actually that Paulo Freire once gave me. He basically said, don't simply transplant my work, but reinvent it in the contextual specificity of where you find yourselves and where others find themselves. So I went on, and I continued to learn from my mistakes. I became much more militant in those days, and learned a lot from tripping over my feet. I'll give you one quick example before I get on to the substance of my talk. I remember I was giving a talk on sociology of education in Medellin, Colombia. And when I was there, I was approached by a group of high school teachers, and they came up to me and they said, "What are you doing at this academic conference, Peter? You're not going to make any changes here. Come to our high school and talk to the faculty and meet some of the students." And so I said, okay. I'd already given my talk. And so I said, let's go. So I hopped in the car, and they took me outside of Medellin to a school called, I remember, I don't know if it still exists, but it was called La Independencia. And I remember walking in, and all the teachers were sitting in a room, and I had someone with me, of course, because of my horrendous Spanish, and who was helping me. And I remember the teacher said, "Peter, we really appreciate your work. We want to follow it's being used in some of the factory schools in Venezuela, but we want to use it here. But we don't really get a lot of your most recent thinking because it takes years and years for stuff to get translated, right, and arrive here in Colombia. It usually comes via Mexico. So tell us what your recent thinking is." And so I said, okay, and I talked about all education should be directed towards creating a post-capitalist society free of the value form of labor, value meaning monetarized labor, right, wage labor, and that we need to create a social universe outside of capital's value form. I'm getting that from, Capital Volume 1, right, Marx's Capital Volume 1. And as I was talking, and some of the teachers started looking nervously at me. And I thought, I'm wondering what I'm doing wrong. I seem to be upsetting the teachers. And so I asked them, what's wrong? And they said, "Peter, really, we can't talk like you." And I said, what do you mean you can't talk like me? We use your ideas, but we can't use your language. You have to understand that there's a civil war going on here in Colombia. And I said, right. And they said, if we use the kind of language that you use to articulate your critical pedagogy, we'll be killed. And I said, maybe, are you exaggerating a little, perhaps? And they said, no, we're not. We'll show you what we mean, Peter. And they walked up to a monitor, a computer monitor at the front of the room, pushed the button, and there was a slideshow that ensued. And it showed young people holding up white sheets on the sidewalk. There looked to be like some commotion and bodies hither and thither. And I said, well, what is this that you're showing me? And they said, Peter, a few years back, we had a visit from the state. And I said, you had a visit from the state? Your neighborhood had a visit from the state. They said, our neighborhood and our school had a visit from the state. I said, I don't know what that means. They said, well, at our school, we don't let the paramilitary come and proselytize. And we don't let the FARC come, the guerrilla come and proselytize. But if the state want to come into our school in our neighborhood, we can't stop them. And so they came in the form of a Black Hawk helicopter provided by the United States, a tank, artillery, 4,000 troops. And when they left the neighborhood, the paramilitary came through, and that was worse. They drag people out of their homes onto their front porches by their hair and shoot them in the forehead in front of their families. So they said, Peter, we can't really use your language. And I said, right. But we're very interested in your ideas, and we have a different approach. We we try to address the trauma of our students, the trauma that they face in their everyday lives. And I said, well, I understand that. So you sort of, you focus on the affect, what we used to call in Bloom's taxonomy, the affective domain. And I said, how successful has your program in critical pedagogy been? And they said, well, before we instituted critical pedagogy and started to engage in your work and the work of other people, 99% of our graduates wanted to join the military and paramilitary after graduation just to protect themselves. Now 99% of our graduates want to go on to university. And I said, that's pretty good. That's pretty good evidence for me that you should continue your program. More recently, my work has taken me to northeast China, or what was formerly Japanese-controlled Manchuria, where I work at Northeast Normal University in Changchun. Under the streets of the city of Changchun, canisters of poison gas manufactured by the Japanese are still packed into storage rooms from the 1940s. The Japanese have offered to come and clean things up under the streets, but the Chinese still don't trust the Japanese enough to do it. Museums are opening up showing biological experiments on Chinese citizens by the Japanese Imperial Army. I'm, again, trying to start a center for critical pedagogy research. They've asked me to be the honorary director, but things are moving very, very slowly. Critical pedagogy is asking dangerous questions, and in a sense calling forth repressed memories in a country where there's a lot of censorship that's very, very difficult. But we're moving very slowly, last year we managed to reissue Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed in Chinese, and gave it new life, I hope. And so that's something positive to report. Well, after reoriented my work towards a Marxist humanism, I met about 5 years ago a wonderful scholar and activist that Bud Hall mentioned yesterday, Ramon Grosfoguel from Berkeley. Ramon is part of a group of decolonial scholars, and along with Anibal Quijano, Enrique Dussel, and many others, Walter Mignolo, who have produced an incredible amount of scholarship on the patron de poder colonial, the coloniality of power. It's an amazing research trajectory that has helped to, I hope, strengthen and broaden my own work. Now, Grosfoguel, Dussel, Quijano, and other decolonial thinkers have argued convincingly that the ego cogito, the I think therefore I am, which underwrites Descartes' concept of modernity, replaced the prior Christian-dominant perspective with a secular, godlike, unsituated, and monolithic politics of knowledge attributed mainly to white European men. The presumed separation and superiorization of mind over body of this ego cogito establishes a knowledge system disassociated from the body's positioning in time and space, and achieves a kind of certitude of knowledge. I think, therefore I am. As if inhabiting a solipsistic universe by means of some kind of internal monologue, isolated from social relations with other human beings. This ego cogito did not suddenly drop from the sky. It arose out of the historical and epistemic conditions of possibility developed through what Enrique Dussel calls the ego conquiro, the I conquer, therefore I am. And the link between the I conquer, therefore I am, and the I think, therefore I am, is the ego extermino. I exterminate you, therefore I Grosvogel and Dussel maintain that the ego conquiro is the foundation of the imperial being, which began with European colonial expansion in 1492, when white men began to think of themselves as the center of the world because they had indeed conquered the world. The ego extermino is a logic of genocide, epistemicide that mediates the I conquer with the epistemic racism, sexism of the I think as a new foundation of knowledge in the modern colonial world. More specifically, the ego extermino can be situated in the four genocides or epistemicides of the 16th century, which Bud Hall summarized for you yesterday, and I won't repeat. Now, this genocidal history has been repressed, and this is an argument I'm trying to make, in the structural unconscious of the nation, of the United States. The term structural unconscious, of course, I take from the work of Richard Lichtman. And the assertion here is that the contradiction between the claims of ideology and the actual structure of social power and the need to defend oneself against socially constructed antagonisms is the primary challenge that faces the ego. The function of the structural unconscious is therefore to reconcile reality and ideology at the level of the nation-state, and this requires conceptual structures to help citizens adjust to its genocidal history. These structures comprise the foundations for coping strategies and are provided by the myths of democracy, rugged individualism, and white supremacy that lie at the heart of U.S. capitalist society. Racialized violence is a domestic expression of the American structural unconscious, whose function is to provide psychic power to the myth of America's providential history. I mean, the history apparently that God has given the United States. So that's kind of a summary of where I'm coming from. Now, for the last 2 years, I've lived in the Old Town area in the city of Orange, described on some websites as the 10th most politically conservative city in the United States. I live with my partner, Wang Yen, or Angie, in a 3-room apartment on top of a popular restaurant overlooking a public parking lot and next to the Army and Navy store that has a wide range of automatic rifles on sale this week. There are evangelical churches everywhere, almost on every corner, it seems. There, preachers preach the prosperity gospel and support Republican presidential candidates, such as the incarnation of the white capitalist id, Donald Trump. The KKK recruits in our city. Every single Wednesday, approximately 50 scruffy-looking, mostly white men ride into town on their Harleys every Wednesday, set up flags in the town square that read, "Freedom is not free. We are your warriors." They set up a microphone and share war stories and describe kill shots from the Vietnam War and speak to an audience of about 30 to 40 townsfolk. I pass them every single Wednesday because I teach on Wednesdays, and I pass them on my way to Chapman University. Now, the city of Orange was once run by the John Birch Society, as John Birch Society ran most of Orange County, although more and more Democrats seem to be moving in, whatever that really means. Chapman stands on Tongva and Monero and Luiseño lands. I teach philosophy, social movements, philosophy, Marxist theory, spirituality, and social movements at Chapman University. At night, the sky lights up from fireworks from Disneyland, or when somebody hits a home run at Angel Stadium. On the way to campus, I nod my head to the shopkeepers who seem to feel comfortable enough now to nod back. On any given day, I might wave a hello to our Nobel Prize winner in economics, Vernon Smith, on the sidewalk on the way to my office, or I might decide to pause at the only existing statue of Paulo Freire in North America and place a flower behind his ear. Of course, Paulo gets lonely sitting there among the other statues that dominate the landscape at Chapman. That include Margaret Thatcher, Ayn Rand, I'm not kidding. Ronald Reagan, George Shultz, Milton Friedman, and founders of various banks. But I'm fortunate to be working with a wonderful and committed group of Freirean educators that make up the Paulo Freire Democratic Project at the College of Educational Studies. And it's a really wonderful faculty, actually. I found it to be just great. So different from where I used to be teaching. I received 2 messages today from them, by the way. One said this, from Chapman faculty: a proposed resolution on climate science education fails to reach the Senate floor. That came today. The other was from the assistant dean, who commented on the heroic role played by 2 teachers during last night's shooting in a movie theater in Lafayette, Louisiana. You may have read about that. 2 teachers apparently, one jumped in front to save the other teacher, and one of the teachers pulled the fire alarm and saved lives. And so she wrote, "I find myself reminded tonight of the smaller acts of heroism that occur every single day in countless schools and classrooms across our country by our nation's teachers." Now, I occasionally teach courses in liberation theology. I taught them off and on at UCLA, but never published work that was largely informed by it. So today I want to share a small sample from a book that will be published next month called Pedagogy of Insurrection: From Resurrection to Revolution. It's a book that contains chapters on Fidel Castro and Pierre Elliott Trudeau, Che Guevara, Paulo Freire, and the late President Hugo Chavez. But the centerpiece of the book is a chapter on Jesus and Christian communism. I was even thinking of starting a church of Christian communism in Orange. I'm seriously was thinking about it, and I haven't given up on that idea yet. The book is designed to break through the structural unconscious of the U.S. context, which I argue, after decolonial theorists, is founded on genocide and epistemicide, as well as ecocide. Now, life doesn't unfold as some old sheet strewn across a brass bed in the dusky attic of history. Our destinies as children, as parents and teachers, do not flow unilaterally towards a single vertigo-inducing epiphany, some pyrotechnic explosion of iridescent and refulgent splendor, where afterwards we lay becalmed, rocking on a silent sea of pure bliss, or where we're held speechless in some wind-washed grove of cedars, happily in the thrall of an unbridled, unsullied, and undiluted love of incandescent intensity. No. Our lives are not overseen by a handsome God who blithely sits atop a terracotta pedestal and with guileless simplicity, a quiet paternalism, and in smiling earnestness rules over his, and I emphasize his, eager and fumbling brood, every so often rumpling the curly heads of the rosy-cheeked cherubim and engaging the saints in blissful conversation about quantum theory. Where there's such a God, wrapped in the mantle of otherworldly Platonism, and possessing neither moral obliquity nor guilt, who brings forth the world through supernatural volition alone, the world would be nothing but an echo of the divine mind. Hunger could be ended by merely thinking of a full belly, and sickness eliminated by a picture of perfect health. Most of us, however, sling ourselves nervously back and forth across the great Manichaean divide of the drab of everyday existence, where, in our elemental contact with the world, our human desires, for better or for worse, tug at us like some glow-in-the-dark hustler in a carnival midway. We go hungry, we suffer, we live in torment and witness most of the world's population crumpled up in pain. We don't have to witness a final miracle of eschatological significance to reclaim the world. What we do have to accomplish at this very moment is organizing our world to meet the basic needs of humanity. But the same message of meeting the needs of humanity was prevalent in the Bible. and occupied the message of Jesus. I do not suddenly mention this out of some otherworldly penchant, but for a concern for the here and now. Now, the majority of citizens in the United States are Christians of some denomination or other, and it's important to point out as an incontrovertible fact that the message of Jesus in the Gospels is focused on the liberation of the poor from captivity and oppression. Thus, in Luke 4:18-19, I quote, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because He has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord." Jesus was very much opposed to oppression and bondage, and it was no secret that He excluded the wealthy from the kingdom of God. Noted in this very clear passage from Matthew 19:16-24. I won't read it, but I'll summarize it. When a young rich man asked Jesus what he must do to achieve eternal life, Jesus advises the man to obey the commandments. But since this young man already observes the commandments, he asks Jesus what else he must do. Jesus tells him that to be perfect he must sell his possessions and give them to the poor, and then he will have treasure in heaven. Then he told the man that he should follow him. But when the young man heard this, he went away with much sorrow, since he owned much property. Let us not walk away from this news with sadness in our hearts, but know through our struggle for social justice that we will achieve a world beyond value production, where differential wealth will not corrupt us and finance capital will not possess our souls. So what the Bible really teaches, at least in terms of the critical exegesis that I have attempted to create, is that Jesus was not against absolute wealth, but relative wealth, or differentiated wealth. You couldn't be rich and have someone else poor. If that were the case, the kingdom of God would not be within your grasp. Now, many of us either openly or secretly harbor a religious faith that often remains hidden between the lines of our manifestos and treatises. I've often maintained the position that the official Church of Jesus has been implicated in the indefensible falsification of the gospel in order to protect the hierarchies of the church. Of course, this is not a new position by any means. But here I wish to amplify this idea by briefly summarizing the important work of the late Mexican Jesuit theologian José Porfirio Miranda, whose work is as prophetic as it is profound. He may well be a kind of new John the Baptist. Miranda's work skillfully corroborates his own analysis of the Bible with those of ecclesiastically sanctioned studies by recognized and prominent Catholic exegetes. According to Miranda, Christian faith is supposed to transform humankind in the world. Miranda claims that the persecution of Christians for the first 3 centuries constrained Christians to present a version of Christianity that would no longer provoke repression, so that after the 4th century, the church acquired a dominant status in class society, and this was what then motivated the continuing falsification of the gospel. Clearly, the message of Jesus is to create the kingdom of God on earth as it has been created in heaven. Jesus is a prototypical rebel, someone whom suburban U.S. parents would continuously warn their children to avoid, and certainly not to befriend. As Terry Eagleton notes, Jesus, unlike most respectable American citizens, appears to do no work, is accused of being a glutton and a drunkard, is presented as homeless, propertyless, celibate, peripatetic, socially marginal, disdainful of kinsfolk, without a trade, a friend of outcasts and pariahs, averse to material possessions, without fear for his own safety, careless about purity regulations, critical of traditional authority, a thorn in the side of the establishment, and a scourge of the rich and powerful. Well, the official teachings of the church falsify the gospel, since it's clear from reading the text of the Bible that Jesus maintains an intransigent condemnation of the rich and differentiated wealth. Even liberation theology gets this wrong when it asserts that there should be a preferential option for the poor. It's not an option, but as Miranda states, it's an obligation. Christians cannot shirk from this obligation without imputation of culpability and still remain Christians. There's no abstention from this struggle. The condition of the poor obliges a restitution, since such a struggle is injustice writ large. Jesus died for participating in a political transgression aimed at liberating Judea from the Romans. According to Miranda, Jesus clearly was a communist. Now, of course, not a communist in the sense of, the Eastern Bloc police states or the ex-Soviet Union, of course, which were state capitalist regimes. They never were communist regimes. You just read Raya Dostoevskaya's theories of state capitalism, you realize that they were state capitalist regimes. But Jesus was clearly a communist, and this can be convincingly be seen throughout the New Testament, but particularly in passages such as John 12:6, 13:29, and Luke 8:1-3. Jesus went so far as to make the renunciation of property a condition for entering the kingdom of God. And when Luke says, "Happy the poor, for yours is the kingdom of God," Luke and adds, "Woe to you the rich, because you have received your comfort." Luke is repeating Mark 10:25 when Jesus warns that the rich cannot enter the kingdom. The Bible then makes clear through Jesus' own sayings that the kingdom is not the state of being after death. Rather, the kingdom is now, here on earth. Essentially, Jesus is saying that in the kingdom there cannot be social differences. That the kingdom, whether or not it pleases the conservatives, is a classless society. Consider what Luke says in Acts. Quote, "All the believers together had everything in common. They sold their possessions and their goods and distributed among all in accordance with each one's need. The heart of the multitude of believers was one, and their soul was one, and not a single one said anything of what he had was his, but all things were in common. There was no poor person among them, since whoever possessed fields or houses sold them, bore the proceeds of the sale, and placed them at the feet of the apostles, and a distribution was made to each in accordance with his needs." Acts 4:32, 34, 35. Benjamin Corey describes the early Christians as forming strong communal bonds. He writes, "These early Christians had a strong sense of community, often meeting in small house churches, a practice that facilitated deeper intimacy as they wrestled with this new faith together. In addition to exploring their faith in a relational way, they also put undiluted community into practice by rejecting the concept of individual ownership in lieu of an according to need, according to ability, redistribution of wealth, a practice that enabled them to eradicate poverty in their community. From each according to his ability to each according to his needs was a famous phrase used by Marx in a letter he wrote in 1875 to the Social Democratic Workers' Party of Germany, which came to be part of his critique of the Gotha program. If you refer to Acts 4:34-35, you will see that Marx simply paraphrased what is already written in the New Testament. Does that mean that the early Christians were communists? Well, perhaps it's better to say that communism proper is a Christian principle that was perverted and distorted in the totalitarian communist regimes of the former Soviet Union and Eastern Bloc countries. The first part of the principle, from each according to their ability, can be understood to mean that all members of society will have the right to use their creative abilities to produce that which benefits the entire society. The second part of the principle, to each according to their needs, explains that citizens will receive from society a fair return for their labor. That is, what is necessary to fulfill their needs. Needs here does not simply refer to material needs, although material needs must be met in order for other needs to be satisfied. I guess am I running out? How much time do I have? 10 minutes. 10? Oh boy. Okay, Corey is clear on this point. The early Christians didn't have megachurches where people watched a pastor with a $250,000 salary preach via jumbotron from a satellite campus. They didn't worship beside people they'd seen several times before, but never actually met. And they didn't preach a hyper-capitalistic American version of Christianity. This is Corey. I'm quoting Corey. The first Christians lived in the context of community and wrestled with an emerging theology among a tight-knit group of friends. Friends who shared every aspect of their lives together, including their wealth. It's often thought that Jesus taught that poverty is something that can never be eradicated, that the poor will always be a natural part of social life. You've probably heard that. But Jesus did not say that the poor will always be with us. He said that the poor are with us all the time. Miranda cites numerous translation sources attesting to this statement. Should be translated as, the poor you have with you at all moments, or continuously, and you can do them good when you wish. On the other hand, you do not have me at all moments. And according to Miranda, Jesus didn't say, my kingdom is not of this world. He said, my kingdom does not come forth from this world, or my kingdom is not from this world, since we can retain the original meaning only if we consider the preposition ek in the original Greek as meaning from, signifying place of origin or provenance. I'm going to wrap up quickly here. So I'm talking about the critique of differentiated wealth, which creates class society, which is endemic to capitalism. For James, differentiating wealth can be acquired only by means of expropriation of the produce of the workers' labor. Therefore, following Jesus and the Old Testament, James condemns differentiating wealth without vacillation or compromise. Profit made in the very process of production is thus specifically imprecated. Miranda explains further what this implies. Where there is no differentiating wealth, where economic activity is directly for the purpose of the satisfaction of needs and not for trade or the operations of buying and selling for profit, government becomes unnecessary. The Bible attacks not only acquired wealth, but the means by which such wealth is accumulated, which is the taking of profit or what could be considered a form of systemic or legalized exploitation. Even the prophets such as Micah and Amos understood that no differentiating wealth can be acquired without spoliation and fraud. Well, I could go on and talk about social sin, and that's what I'm basically examining now, is structural sin or social sin, and using liberation theologians to help. I'm just going to make one more point here, and then I will conclude. The great Brazilian Dominican friar, Frei Beto, a close friend and co-author with Paulo Freire, maintained that we in the Ivory Tower tend to view the Bible as a window, whereas peasant or base communities see it as a mirror. According to Brown, we tend to use the Bible as a window, enabling us to see what's happening somewhere else. Oh, this happened in Bible times, when God was fairly available, apparently. And we hope to be transformed to be what we see out there. In contrast, members of the base communities in Latin America use the Bible as a mirror, not a window, in which they see their own reality reflected and hope to learn about themselves in the process. Ernst Bloch's ontology of not yet being, that exists in a tension between a meta-ontic full being and an ontic being in process, can provide a new eschatology of religion, what we could call eschatological communism, grounded in the concept of concrete utopia, which opens the path to a new type of praxis, or what I could call a new type of orthopraxis. So, to conclude, my concluding few paragraphs. Our moral imperatives oblige us to duty, to action. We are obliged to treat people of the future as having infinite dignity, and we appeal to rationality to negate the distinction between what is just and what is unjust. Here we are not guided by procedural ethics imposed by democracy, but by our criteria and content, when we affirm that all people are to be treated with infinite dignity, which entails some degree of reciprocal respect, the real meaning of Rousseau's general will, in contrast to his will of all. Here, educators committed to social transformation through incremental means can take heed from the words of Miranda. The true revolutionary abjures reformist palliatives, because these divert the efforts of the people most capable of fomenting rebellion against the bourgeois system into rejuvenating and refurbishing it. Such palliatives thus constitute the system's best defense. By the same token, the revolutionary must find any change in the socioeconomic system to be a priori inadequate, if that change does not involve a radical revolution in people's attitudes towards each other. If exchange value and the desire for personal gain continue to exist, they will inevitably create other oppressive and exploitive economic systems. Okay. And then this is a little poetic, it's a little sort of Catholic, if you could forgive me, just the concluding paragraph. Perhaps one day, while decamping from your conference on the Common Core, or value-added instruction, you'll find time to ponder this choice. After your continental breakfast at Motel 6, you might consider glancing across the street at the empty lot of Jimson Wade, concrete shards, gasoline-soaked soil, and mercury vapors. There you'll find a man in seamless twill-woven pants, clutching his rake handle with a long iron ridge nail driven into the tip, colorfully festooned with collapsed styrofoam cups and Chuck E. Cheese and Happy Meal coupons. He's the one spearing paper wrappers along the spongy gutters. Look to the right, and you'll notice a communion chalice and a bagel crust sitting on a collapsed lawn chair. Are you telling me that it's really a can of Coca-Cola? Then focus the eyes of your imagination. The new world exists already in our hearts, and our hearts are always already learning. The heart is more than a physical muscle that pumps blood through our body. The heart is a space of possibility, the potential for living in a hoped-for world. The heart is the organ of all pedagogy, activated by relationships, by engagement with community, and sustained by love, by solidarity, and by hope. Thank you. Wow. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yes, please, sir. Thank you, Peter, for that great presentation. Just want to know how you see the work of Pope Francis.
Yes.
Especially his latest encyclical and how it relates to some of what you're saying.
Fantastic question. Can I grab this or not?
It's kind of wound around there.
It's kind of wound around. Okay, I won't try to. When Pope Francis was elected, he was elected shortly after Hugo Chavez died. And I was in mourning for President Chavez, who I consider a great hero. He got a bad rap in North America. And I was cynical when Pope Francis was elected, because I realized by Pope Francis' own admission that he didn't speak out sufficiently strong enough against the military, U.S.-supported military-backed regime in Argentina, where many were tortured, killed, and eviscerated, basically. And I suspected that they'd elected a Latin American pope to calm down the rising leftist regimes of America Latina. I thought, he's there to calm things down, to calm the Colombianos, Venezolanos, Mexicanos down, who were starting to rise up in protest against capitalism and neoliberal capitalism, through Evo Morales, etc., Chavez or Maduro now, et cetera, et cetera. So I was really skeptical. And I wrote a kind of cynical piece. I published it. I'm not sure where I published it. I think it was Policy Futures or something. And I now resent that. I regret doing that. And I've revised my opinion of Pope Francis. I think that I've heard that a lot of conservative Catholics are waiting for him to die. I also heard he had one lung, and they're waiting for him to die. I think what he's doing is I never thought in my lifetime that I would find a pope that would be so sympathetic with my political views. Now, it's interesting. The conservative Catholics, it's interesting. When he critiques capitalism, they will go on their websites, which I check regularly, and they will say, oh, the Pope's not really criticizing capitalism. He's criticizing greedy capitalists. He's really criticizing greed, not capitalism. And the interesting thing about, at least the work I'm doing, is a Marxist humanist. By humanist, I don't mean atheist. I'm Catholic. I'm a relatively devout Catholic. That Pope Francis is, I don't really know if Pope Francis is what Pope Francis is really referring to, but my sense is that my intuition tells me that he's critiquing capitalism as a system. The work that I'm doing, of course, would argue that it doesn't matter if you have good capitalists. I know a lot of great capitalists. They're loving, giving people that give to charities, etc. And it's not a question of good capitalists. It's a question of capitalism. When the workers brought me to Argentina in their reoccupied factories, I think Naomi Klein did a documentary on these factories at one point. And they wanted a meeting with me in Buenos Aires, and they said to me, Peter, we've achieved socialism in our factories. And I said, well, you've gotten rid of the capitalists, but you haven't gotten rid of capitalism. It's not a question of moving moving the private ownership of the means of production to the collective ownership of the means of production. It's still the capitalist means of production. You've got to move against value production. But it's interesting about Marx because now I find in Latin America we have conferences now, the Instituto McLaren, which is just, I'm an honorary member. I don't benefit from it at all, but they named it Instituto McLaren. But we have conferences every year in different cities around Mexico called Volver a Marx, Return to Marx. And it's interesting, the indigenous communities that are very interested in representatives who come to our conferences. Marx was kind of anathema to a lot of indigenous groups. And now we're finding a lot of Marx's writings where he talks about indigenous groups. Marx was thought to be this sort of Western guy who looked at, the land as something to be exploited. But in fact, as the work of John Bellamy Foster and others have shown, Marx, in some ways, it could be argued that he was one of our first ecologists, if you really look at his work carefully. So there's been a lot of myths about Marx which need to be exploded. But yes, I just hope that this is, Pope Francis, this is not just some big PR campaign, and I wake up one day and go, oh my goodness.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yes.
Last one, then we'll break.
Thank you so much, Peter. I never expected to hear anybody, including yourself, combine what felt to me like Ginsberg and Marx and Jesus all in one sort of, very wonderfully constructed, kind of literary, poetic discourse. So it's really a thrill to experience that. As you know, and many of us who work in the decolonization or the anti-oppressive kinds of movements of all of these years, In Africa, for example, the church, the Catholic Church, not only the Catholic Church, but don't include that, it has been the instrument for, of epistemicide, of killing, African tradition. It's been the same in Canada. Many of the residential schools are Catholic schools. And we know that, some of those evangelical churches that you live around, across the street from where you can buy the guns, are handmaidens of this market utopian dream. So I'm curious. Your discourses around education and knowledge and so forth, pedagogy over the years. I knew where one would go with those, who you could talk to, how you could counter. Where do you think? Where do you think this discourse on Comrade Jesus? How do progressive? How would we use this? And is this some kind of fire extinguisher foam that we can spray all over those evangelicals, or what's going to happen here?
Well, I want to reclaim Jesus from the right and from the what's called well, let me answer it this way, I guess, quickly as I can. There's a notion of the U.S. providential history. It was interesting. I have a friend who was at Fresno State, she's now at Oklahoma, who was giving a talk on her work on Cuba in Miami. And she came up to me and she said, "Peter, I got my first paid gig on my work I did in Cuba." I said, "Where?" "Miami." I said, "Oh, good. In the audience will be several CIA." And she said, "Come on, Peter, you're always exaggerating. You're kind of a storyteller." I said, "No, you'll find there'll be CIA, and they might actually identify themselves." She comes back from her talk. She said, "Peter, a CIA agent came up to me after my talk, and he I think he had a bit of a crush on this professor, and she was sort of playing that to get some information, and he actually gave her a CD, which she made me a copy of information on Che Guevara in the CIA archives, which were declassified. Still, it's nice to have. And then she showed her, but wouldn't give copies of the textbooks that the CIA had already created for Cuban schools with this belief that once Fidel died, everyone's going to be moving out into the streets, hooray, 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 and just falsifying, the history of the Cuban Revolution, et cetera, as you can expect. Well, I've actually had in my hands books that are being used in some of the charter schools, religious charter schools, that talk about Americans' providential history and basically saying, whatever the United States does, we can't understand God's reason, but the United States will never make a mistake. Actually, George Bush Sr. said that once. He said, "I will never apologize for the United States, no matter what the United States does." There is this feeling that the United States has been given a special calling by God to so-called civilize the world, and that even if things look awful and horrible, that it's all part of God's wisdom, and we can never understand it because we're human. That frightened the hell out of me, and I know that that's the message, and I want to start a debate about Jesus. Now, I'm risking turning the community upside down a little bit. This isn't original, I'm basing a lot of my ideas on liberation theologians from Latin America, and from James Cone, the African-American theology of liberation. So I use in my courses, I use Vine Deloria, God is Red. I use a lot of different literature, but primarily I wanted to use the figure of Jesus and depotentiate the power of Jesus' message for the evangelical right and see where that goes. And I think we need to talk about this in our schools. Yeah.
You forgot to mention that Jesus was queer too.
I wouldn't That's very, very likely true.